Before we begin, let me ask you something. Have you ever heard a story so mysterious, so heartbreaking, and so miraculous that it made you question what's truly possible in this world? Tonight, I'll share with you one such story, the story of a forgotten old soldier and the night when heaven itself seemed to open for him. If you want to hear more stories like this, tales of faith, mystery, and miracles, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell icon so you never miss another story. Your support keeps these stories alive. It began in the quiet town of Willow Creek, a little American community tucked deep in the Midwest where the wheat fields bent like golden seas under the September winds. Life there was slow, predictable, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's name and gossip traveled faster than the church bells on a Sunday morning. Children played barefoot on cracked sidewalks, women baked pies cooling on their windowsills, and the men, old men mostly, gathered outside the hardware store to talk about the weather and shake their heads about politics. But behind the ordinary rhythm of life in Willow Creek was a shadow, a story whispered at the back of the church, told in hushed tones when strangers weren't listening, for tucked behind the abandoned railway station, living in a makeshift shelter of torn blankets and cardboard, there was a man almost no one dared to approach. His name was Walter Jameson. Walter was 98 years old, though if you saw him limping with his crooked cane, you might have guessed he was older than time itself. His back bent like a question mark, his face a map of deep trenches carved by war, loss, and loneliness. Most people knew only fragments of his story, that he had fought in more than one war, World War II, Korea, and even in the early days of Vietnam. Some said he had been decorated. Others claimed he had once been a commander. Nobody was sure, because Walter never talked about medals, only about men who never came home. Children were told to stay away from him. Don't go near that old soldier, mothers warned. He's half crazy, talks to ghosts, and in truth, Walter often spoke aloud when no one was there, muttering names, praying, sometimes cursing into the wind. Yet there was something about him, something unbroken despite the ruin of his life. He wore his torn army jacket every single day, even in the blazing July heat. He carried with him a small rosary missing 2 beads, its chain worn thin, and though his hands shook, he held it with reverence. Those who passed by late at night swore they heard him whispering Hail Marys into the darkness. But not everyone respected him. The town had been going through hard times, the factory had closed, young folks had moved away, and anger hung in the air like dust. One Saturday night, a group of teenagers, bored, drunk, and loud, stumbled near the small church on Main Street. It was an old wooden building, with a statue of the Virgin Mary standing proud in front, her face gentle, her hands open in mercy. Generations had prayed before that statue. Old farmers before planting, widows lighting candles for lost sons, even children dropping wildflowers at her feet. That night, the boys mocked her, they shouted, they laughed, they threw empty beer cans at the base of the statue. One of them, spurred on by the others, climbed onto the pedestal and pressed a cigarette into the carved marble cheek of Mary, leaving a black burn mark like a scar. They roared with laughter, stumbling back into the night, unaware, or perhaps too young to understand, that something sacred had been defiled. And the very next morning, the accidents began. A tractor overturned in a field, killing a man who had been one of the loudest mockers of the church. Another boy from that group fell mysteriously ill, his skin turning pale, his body racked with fevers doctors could not explain. Chickens stopped laying eggs, the town's water pump broke for the first time in 40 years, and even the sky seemed wrong, gray for days, as if the sun itself was in mourning. It was during this uneasy time that Walter Jameson began to dream. He would wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding, drenched in sweat, certain he had seen her, a woman clothed in light, her face soft and sorrowful, her voice calling his name, Walter. Walter, do not be afraid. Sometimes he would see her hands, delicate yet strong, reaching out to him from a great distance. Other times, he would see a battlefield, men falling around him, and then her image appearing above the smoke like a lantern in the night. Walter thought he was going mad. Perhaps it was the hunger. He barely ate more than scraps left behind the diner. Perhaps it was the cold. The September nights bit deep, and his thin blanket could not keep the chill from his bones. Or perhaps, he thought, it was simply the mind's cruel trick at the end of a long, bitter life. But then people in town began whispering about him, too. Mrs. Carter, the baker's widow, swore she saw Walter kneeling before the damaged statue one morning at dawn, and when he touched the blackened scar on Mary's face, the marble seemed to shimmer faintly, as if glowing from within. A farmer claimed he saw Walter standing in the middle of the road, talking to someone who wasn't there, and the air around him smelled suddenly of roses. And one little girl, Sarah, just 7 years old, told her mother that she had seen the pretty lady in blue standing beside Walter near the railway tracks. The priest, Father O'Connell, grew concerned. He was a cautious man, not quick to call anything a miracle, but he also knew better than to dismiss the faith of his flock. He visited Walter in his ragged shelter and found the old soldier sitting silently, his rosary clutched so tight his knuckles were white. "Walter," the priest said softly, "people are saying strange things, about you, about visions." Walter lifted his eyes, and for the first time in years, tears ran freely down his wrinkled cheeks. His voice cracked when he whispered, "Father, she's calling me, I don't know why, but the Virgin herself is calling me." The priest sat with him a long time, listening, uncertain what to believe, but he could not deny the trembling in his own chest, the goosebumps rising on his arms. Days turned into weeks, and the strange happenings only grew. Birds circled the church at night, forming patterns like crosses in the sky. The river that ran through town overflowed its banks without any rain, flooding only the street where the boys who had mocked the statue lived. People began lighting candles in fear as much as in devotion. And through it all, Walter's dreams grew stronger. One night, he saw himself as a young soldier again, standing on a battlefield filled with smoke. He heard gunfire, men screaming, the thunder of tanks, and then, through the chaos, he saw her, the Virgin Mary, radiant, her robe flowing, her eyes filled with sorrow and mercy. She raised her hand toward him and whispered words that shook him to his core. "Walter, it is not too late." When he woke, trembling, he could still smell roses. By now, the town was divided. Some believed Walter was chosen, that God had sent the Virgin to this forgotten soldier as a sign. Others scoffed, calling him delusional, a crazy old man whose mind had finally cracked. But nobody could deny that something was happening in Willow Creek, something beyond reason. And then came the night when everything changed. It was bitter cold, the first snow of winter dusting the streets white. Walter lay shivering under his thin blanket, the wind rattling the broken boards of his shelter. He had not eaten in 2 days, his body ached, his breath came shallow, and for the first time, he thought death was near. But as his eyes fluttered closed, he felt warmth, a gentle light spread across his face, and when he opened his eyes, he saw her, not in a dream, but standing before him. The Virgin Mary. Her presence filled the broken shack with light, softer than the sun but brighter than fire. She was clothed in blue, her hands open, her eyes full of love and sorrow. Walter tried to rise, but his body was too weak. He whispered through cracked lips, "Mother of God, why me?" And she smiled. The snow outside fell heavier, the wind howled through the town. But inside that little shelter, all was calm, all was silent. And that night marked the beginning of a miracle that would shake Willow Creek forever. The morning after that night, Willow Creek woke in a hush so heavy it felt like cloth pulled over every window. The snow from the first storm lay in soft drifts, muffling the usual sounds, the engines in the lot, the dogs that barked at dawn, the creak of old porches. People moved slowly, blinking as if they were waking into someone else's life. News of what had happened to Walter, what he said he'd seen, had already threaded through the town before the baker opened his shop. Some said he'd finally died and been taken straight to heaven, others said he was lying to get attention, but most, the ones who bent their heads and put their hands together as they passed the church, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Father O'Connell kept his coat buttoned up tight as he walked the small square toward the church. He had fed Walter a bit of porridge the day before and stayed long into the afternoon, listening to the old man's memories. Now the priest rubbed his palms together, trying to warm them, and thought about the fragile line between faith and delusion. He'd been taught to be careful, there were false visions, tricks of the mind. But he could not forget the look in Walter's eyes. Something honest lived there. If the Virgin had come to a man with no roof and no family, was that not the sort of thing saints were supposed to do? By noon, the church steps were no longer empty. A few neighbors lingered where they could see the statue from across the square. Some left candles, some left small bouquets tied with blue ribbon. The blackened burn mark on Mary's cheek still showed, an ugly, stubborn stain. But something else was happening, too. Where the cigarette had touched the marble the evening before, very faintly, a hairline crack seemed to glow in the morning light, not like the reflection of sun, but like a soft, persistent ember just beneath the surface. "Maybe it's the angle," one of the grocery clerks muttered, but her voice went thin. She crossed herself like an automatic reflex before her hands could steady. Word spread as these things do in small towns, not by radio or television, but by mothers at school pickups, by men in the feed store, by the mailman who lingered for a half-second and then passed by the church with more haste than usual. A few out-of-towners arrived in rental cars, the kind of people who smell a story and a chance to see it with their own 2 eyes. They took pictures, leaned on their hoods, and spoke in low tones. To them it was news, to the people of Willow Creek it was a wound, a welcome, or both. Walter's face changed over the next days in ways the town noticed and whispered about. He did not suddenly become spry, no miracle of youth, but there were small things that made neighbors shift in their seats as they sipped coffee at the diner. He began to stand straighter when he walked, like someone had jabbed a stiff rod down the center of his spine, and once, when a nearby child dropped a toy and sobbed, Walter bent and picked it up without the hesitation he'd had in months. His hands were still scarred and knuckled with arthritis, but they held the toy gently, as if he understood the value of each small thing. People came to see him, not the teenagers who had thrown the beer cans. Most of them now kept their heads low, but farmers, the postmistress, an old war buddy who remembered Walter from long summers in dusty barracks. They found him at the edge of the railway where he had put a thin blanket over a stack of broken crates. They brought thermoses of coffee and slices of pie. They left not just food, but letters folded in envelopes, handwritten notes from people who had been touched in some quiet way. One woman, who had lost a child years ago, pressed a small scrap of cloth into Walter's hand and told him not to lose faith. He read them all with a slow attention and folded them into the pocket of his tired jacket. But the town itself felt watched. Little, inexplicable things kept happening. Farm dogs would not go near the statue after dusk. They would whine and whimper, whining crosses of worry until their owners carried them inside. The milkman's cart, old Mr. Brannan, lost a wheel on the road 3 mornings running. Always near the church, the hardware store owner, who had been a skeptic and a practical man, found one of his most prized hammers gone. Later he reported seeing it leaning upright at the base of the statue as if propped there by an invisible hand. Even the skeptics were pulled, if only a little, toward reverence. For the first time in years the church filled for nightly prayers. Nobody wanted to sit in the front pews, but they came. They sang in a lopsided, trembling chorus. Candles outshone the overhead lights, and there, at the center of it all, Father O'Connell tried to be both shepherd and balance, careful not to promise what he could not prove, while also not discouraging those who had come with heavy hearts in search of comfort. Within the congregation, a woman named Agnes pulled a handkerchief from her sleeve and dabbed her eyes. She'd been married to a miner for 42 years, the mine had closed, and she had seen more hard times than the town should have been given. "I'm not a hyperbolic woman," she told anyone who would listen, "but when I stood by that statue, the air changed, my arthritis loosened, I could breathe easier." The same week, a carpenter who had a severe cough, something that clung even after he quit smoking, found it gone for 3 days. So sure was he that it would return that he called in sick just to stay in the peace. It didn't come back. He started showing up early to mass. With the crowd came questions. The mayor, a blunt man who liked to keep the town on even keel, called a meeting in the town hall. He wanted to keep Willow Creek from becoming a spectacle. Tourists could bring money, yes, but they could also bring desecration. He asked the priest to be careful, and the priest agreed, but the mayor also hired an electrician to check the church lights, a plumber for the pump, and even a young woman with a camera to keep a record of anything unusual. People wanted proof, they wanted signs. So evidence began to be kept, a ledger with names of those who claimed healings, photographs of the statue taken at different hours, and a growing pile of prayer requests left near the altar. A teenage girl, a good student who had lost an eye in a car accident years before and had never adjusted to wearing glass, came and fell to her knees. She prayed loud, voice breaking, for a moment that felt raw and true. That night she slept without pain for the first time in ages. The small victories multiplied. Some were plainly explainable, some weren't, but each one knitted more of the town into the story. Not everyone rejoiced. Warnings came, too. An old man who had lived in Willow Creek since his youth, Mr. Henley, who had been a janitor at the school and knew the town's secrets, warned that the past sometimes repeated itself. He'd read an old newspaper clipping, faded, brittle paper, about the same statue 50 years earlier. Back then, the town had been saved from a summer drought by a rainstorm that came the day after people had fasted and prayed. The story framed the statue as guardian, but stories in small towns are not simple. Henley remembered that a man had been accused of witchcraft, not because he did anything, but because townsfolk needed someone to blame when misfortune came. "We're good at that," Henley said grimly, "blaming people when we're scared." And the fear rolled in as steadily as the winter. A woman at the diner, who had once gambled recklessly and lost everything, suddenly swore she saw shadows moving in the churchyard at midnight. The high school principal, normally a pragmatic man, called in the school counselor after several children reported nightmares where the statue's eyes followed them. The counselor took little notes and then told nobody about them. He was careful not to inflame a town already on edge. On a Thursday, cold, but bright, someone threw a rock through the church's stained glass window. It was a single stone that landed with a small, shuddering shock and smashed a fragment of blue like a sad note. The town woke with a collective breath held in for too long. Who would do such a thing? The teenagers, it was quickly assumed. They had always been restless, but no one could find a trail leading back to any of them. The police took statements and then took none. The mayor insisted on a patrol. Father O'Connell said mass that night with a quiet anger in his voice that surprised everyone. He reminded the congregation that faith asked for courage, not cruelty. Meanwhile, Walter's dreams did not relent. If anything, they sharpened. He would wake with a single phrase on his lips, as if some tape of words had been rewound and pressed into him. Once it was, "Guard the light," and another night, "Remember his name." He could not explain why his mind reached for these fragments, but the people who came to see him, those who sat on a milk crate or leaned on a fence post, began copying them down. They pinned his words to the ledger. The town turned these into quiet prayers. Guard the light. It became like a prayer cardigan they folded over their shoulders when the wind cut deep. One afternoon, a woman who ran the local library found an old ledger tucked in a box inside the church's attic. She dusted its cover and opened it slowly. The handwriting inside curled across the page, old-fashioned and careful. It dated back to 1893 and recorded a drought, a vigil, and then a flood that saved the crops. The entry concluded with a note: "She answers in seasons." The librarian, Miss Taylor, brought the ledger down to Father O'Connell, who found his hands trembling when he read the line out loud in the empty parish office. "She answers in seasons." What did that mean? That the Virgin visited when the town needed her? Or that the town had long been part of a pattern it had forgotten? At night, the town's stories tangled. Some remembered that their grandparents had told of a woman in blue who had once walked the hills outside Willow Creek. Others had only the memory of a hymn that stilled at pardons and wakes. There were old photographs of the church from eras past, black and white faces braided into the margins. It felt as if the present had braided itself into a larger string of years. And when things line up like that, memory, history, rumor, people begin to see meaning. Even in the smallest objects, a torn ribbon caught in the church gate, a faded photograph of a soldier with a face uncannily like Walter's, taken decades ago and labeled only, "To my boys." Not everyone found comfort in the ledger or the photographs. Some saw danger. A woman who ran the diner kept a matchbook behind the counter more for luck than utility. She told herself the swelling of townsfolk into religious fervor could be dangerous. History had enough tales of mobs and of scapegoats. She kept her mouth shut. But at night she would stare at the loop of rosary left on the shelf and think of how quickly fear could turn neighbor against neighbor. Then came a night in late January when the wind came like a blade and the sky held its breath. Walter stood near the church's edge, wrapped in several blankets brought by a neighbor, his rosary between his fingers. He had been invited to sleep in the rectory for warmth, but he preferred the open air, saying he needed to smell the earth. People had been clustering elsewhere, some at the church steps, some at the diner. Folks who had never prayed had started to. Suddenly, a sound like a bell came from nowhere, an actual bell, clear and bright. The parish bell was broken. It had been fixed back in the 70s and hardly ever rang, but that night it chimed 3 times, slow and hollow. Heads turned, footsteps quickened. Even men who had sworn they would not be seen near the church found themselves walking there in the snow. Walter walked, too, his cane cutting slow arcs in the fresh drift. When he reached the statue, the air felt different, almost electric. He stopped, panting, and then steadied himself. Someone in the crowd, a thin woman with a shawl over her hair, said that the snow at Mary's feet had melted in a perfect circle as if by a small hearth. A child pressed his nose against the cold bronze of the church gate and said he could see a shape like a face in the snow, though whether it was a trick of the shadow or something else nobody could say for sure. Walter raised his head and looked up at Mary. The statue's face did not change, but those who watched said they felt the warmth of a presence, as if an old house exhaled and let go. Walter's lips moved. He did not speak loudly, but his words found their way free. He recited the names of the men he'd loved in war, boys who had been his brothers, and then, beneath that, he added one more by name. A young soldier who had once shared rations and a laugh with him, a man whose face he had never been able to reclaim from memory. He said the name as if it were an offering, setting the sound down at the statue's feet. No thunder answered, no lightning split the sky, but as Walter finished, a hush fell so complete that someone in the back whispered, "Did you hear that?" The hush was broken by a whispering wind and then a low sound, not a voice and not quite a human noise, like a choir rehearsing in the next room of the world. It made the hair on the backs of necks stand up. Someone dropped to their knees, someone else covered their mouth with both hands. The mayor, who had been watching from the doorway of his car, fumbled for his hat. When the sound stopped, Walter did not move. He had closed his eyes and seemed to be listening, a thin smile on the corner of his mouth. Father O'Connell moved closer, fearing faintness, but Walter reached out and the priest took his hand. For a long moment they stood there, the old and the ordained, hand in hand beneath the statue that had been burned and then warmed. Somewhere in the crowd, a child began to hum a tune that sounded like an old hymn, and others took it up, low and scared but certain. Then a voice, soft, ordinary, and absolutely human, spoke from nowhere and everywhere. "Careful," it said, and everyone flinched because the voice sounded like the wind but had the cadence of someone warning a loved one. "Careful with the light." That was all, a single word and a tremor that shook the square, and with that word the town both swelled with hope and tightened into fear. If there was a messenger, who had given the warning? If there was a warning, what did it mean? Guard the light, careful with the light, remember his name. People left slowly that night, some mumbling prayers, some shrouded with bewilderment. The town had moved beyond simple curiosity. It had, in a few short weeks, leapt into a story that could not be ignored. The ledger was taken out, prayers were written and taped into its pages, and pews were filled like a town holding its breath. Walter returned to his blanket by the tracks, but he did not sleep. He stared up into the downy sky, feeling a tiredness that was also a readiness. He touched his rosary and hummed one of the old songs he'd sung in foxholes and in barracks, and the song held a memory like a light in his chest. Above him, the stars seemed less distant. Below him, the town shivered into the long night, and in the quiet that followed, many wondered, with equal parts dread and hope, whether the story that had come through their lives had only just begun, or whether it would demand a price none of them could imagine. The days after the bell chimed and the voice warned felt like they were stretched thin over glass. People moved with care, speaking softly as if the wrong syllable might break whatever fragile thread held the town together. Willow Creek filled with strangers who came for different reasons, some with cameras and questions, others with rosaries and intent faces. The mayor tried to keep order, posting notices and asking people to leave the church grounds tidy. He called a meeting with the town council, the priest, and a couple of sober-minded townsfolk who might speak sense into those who were frightened or greedy. But sense was a thing that seemed to leave Willow Creek in a hurry these days. Miracles and fear make strange bargains. The national reporter arrived on a Tuesday with a microphone and a polite, skeptical smile. He asked Father O'Connell for an interview and then found Walter without much trouble. There were always folks around him now, women with knitted mittens, an old barber with a comb tucked behind his ear, a man who had come from the next county to confess that his mother had once been helped by this exact statue during a fever. The reporter watched Walter with a kind of gentle curiosity. When he asked for a comment, Walter simply said, "She's with us." That answer got the headline the next day, Virgin Mary visits Midwestern town. The paper ran a black and white photo of the statue with a streak of light in the background that some swore wasn't a camera artifact. With attention came other things, late-night calls, offers of money, and the subtle creep of opportunists. A woman in a bright coat tried to sell rosaries at the diner, but the town turned on her quickly, an instinct for protection that surprised even those who had once believed they'd lost everything. A small group from a neighboring town attempted to stage a faith tour, promising buses and pilgrimage packages. The mayor shut them down with a firm letter and a single meeting that left the would-be organizers muttering about small-town politics. Inside the church, things changed more quietly. The priest kept a journal, small and leather-bound, where he wrote down names of those who asked for prayers and recorded small miracles and odd occurrences. He was careful with language. A miracle, he reminded himself on the first page, was not a thing to claim lightly. He wrote instead of "unexplained restorations," and "comfort observed," and kept a running list of testimonies from nurses, a teacher, and a vet who had a limp that lessened when he prayed. He kept the ledger on the altar but locked it at night with a key he carried on a plain chain. Walter became, for better or worse, the town's quiet center. He wasn't giddy with fame. The attention made his old face fold into itself sometimes, as if the uninvited eyes pressed upon him too much. He would sit for hours under the awning of the closed railway station, hands folded, rosary looped around his finger. People came to him in small streams, an ex-soldier who wept openly, a mother who had been praying for a prodigal son, a schoolteacher who asked about the dreams. Walter answered plainly. He spoke of smoke and fear and of a bright woman who smelled of roses. He said the Virgin never promised wealth or a life without sorrow. She promised presence, and sometimes presence asked a price. There were nights, few but impossible to ignore, when something unexplainable happened in plain view. On one such night, a power outage swept the town. The lights went out not because the grid failed but because bulbs seemed to shudder and die one by one, leaving the streets stitched with darkness. People stumbled to their porches and peered into the black. At the church, someone lit a candle, then another, until the altar glowed as if the sun had been cradled in the nave. Across town, in homes that were usually empty, radios clicked on without being touched, hymn, old, low, and strangely tuneless, played for a few bars and then died. The effect was not frightening so much as intimate, it felt like a secret being shared among neighbors. Not all signs were gentle. Old Mr. Henley's warning returned in the form of rumor, that in another village 100 miles away, a man's livestock had gone mad when a woman's statue had been desecrated. People remembered the burned cheek on Willow Creek statue and wondered if disrespect could open doors. That question made the nights heavier. Patrols started, and small groups of men, neighbors who had never stood together before, took shifts guarding the church after dark. A few boys who had once laughed at the statue now kept watch with knitted faces and bared teeth like frightened wolves. Through all this, Walter's dreams took on a different shape. The figures he saw were not only battlefield ghosts but also children he once cared for, faces of men who had died on his watch, and, more often than not, a young soldier's face he could not forget. He spoke of this soldier to Father O'Connell one afternoon while the wind knocked dry leaves across the churchyard. "Name him," Father O'Connell said, with the calm of someone who wanted to help a lost person find a name. Walter closed his eyes and inhaled, a breath like one of the old bellows you find in garages and sheds. "Eddie Mallory," he said finally, "haven't said that name in 60 years. Eddie Mallory, there it was. The name slotted into the town's story like a missing tooth into a jaw. It seemed to echo in the small spaces of the church. Who was Eddie? The town tried to learn. They combed through old scrapbooks and called up dusty records. Eddie Mallory's name appeared in a photograph, sepia-toned, tucked in a frame at the back of the library. A group of soldiers smiling like boys on a summer day, 3 of them leaning on each other as if they would never be forced to part. One of those faces matched a scar on Walter's cheek. Another matched the face of a man in a town who had seldom spoken of his youth. Eddie's name was on a list somewhere in the county archives. Kia, 1944, the county veterans office sent a bundle of papers, yellowed and clasped, which the mayor handed over in a small, respectful ceremony. The community's attention sharpened. Eddie Mallory's sister, a woman named Clara who had lived her life near the river and who'd once been a seamstress for the church, came forward after a neighbor recognized her in an old photograph. She was smaller than Walter remembered, and her hands shook when she reached for his. She said she had written letters to the War Office and to Eddie and had folded his face into the back of a thin Bible she kept beneath her mattress. She told stories in a voice that was both proud and pained, a woman who had loved a boy and then had buried him in a photograph. The presence of Eddie's sister made the story personal in a way that made people's throats ache. Those who had been content to watch the phenomenon like a play now had someone in the audience whose life had been graded by loss. Clara sat in the back of the church for weeks, clutching her hands, and when she spoke at the town meeting her voice was small and clear. "If this is a sign," she said, "it's for the ones that never got to come back. Maybe it's for them, maybe it's for us who keep their lamps lit." Her words made grown men look away. For months after, people left small oil lamps at the foot of the statue, a glimmer of devotion in the cold. But devotion breeds complications. A disagreement about the ledger flared into a quarrel between 2 women at the church, a fight not about faith but about whose story should be recorded and whose should be left to memory. Accusations of hoarding prayers were whispered, and a rumor, silly and sharp like a wasp, spread that the ledger was being used to sell favors. Father O'Connell chastened them, and the town cooled, but the petty friction showed how quickly fear and hope make people small. One afternoon as February folded into March, a man came from a neighboring city with a clipboard and an air of authority. He introduced himself as Dr. Harold Sims, an anthropologist who studied folklore and community rituals. He asked to look at the ledger and to speak to Walter. The town welcomed him with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Dr. Sims had a polite way of asking questions, the sort that pried open souls without seeming to. He listened to Father O'Connell. He asked the barber about the rosary, and he sat with Walter for a long hour while sunlight sifted through the bare church trees. "You believe?" he asked Walter softly. Walter's face, which otherwise moved slowly like a man peeling away old layers, found a single honest line. "I don't know what belief is anymore," he said. "I know what's inside me, and she's been here." Dr. Sims took notes with a slow, steady hand. He asked about dreams, about local legends, about the old ledger. He asked whether people had come to the church before storms and had been spared. He took a photograph of Walter without the flash and then left, promising a piece in a national magazine that might treat Willow Creek kindly. The townsfolk were thrilled and terrified. The attention had the shape of a cure and of a wound. Then something happened that no one could easily square away. One night, the statue, Mary, with her gentle carved face and stone hands, began to weep, not in the poetic sense but literally. A slow drip from the corner of the marble eye. water tracing down the cheek and leaving tracks that caught the street lamp light like jewels. People who watched from across the square swore that the droplets were clear and felt warm if you reached a glove out to them. Father O'Connell knelt and pressed a handkerchief to a stone cheek. He tasted the tear, a foolish act of devotion and disbelief, and found it salty and pure like any other human tear. Word of the weeping drew a crowd that felt like a tide. Someone took a video on a small phone. Someone else swore a church custodian had seen the tears roll down a week earlier but had been too frightened to speak. Scientists were mentioned, oxygen and condensation and weather phenomena. The national reporter wrote an article that used the word irrefutable, and then walked back on it. The mayor issued a statement urging calm and respect. For all the talk of science, for all the skeptics and their murmured reasons, watching the statue weep was an intimate thing. It made some people cry and others shake. Parents wrapped children closer, and old men crossed themselves in the open. The weeping continued for 3 nights, then stopped as gently as it had begun, like a faucet turned slowly off. The parish ledger grew heavier with petitions. People left wet handkerchiefs, notes, and coins that melted into the dirt like little offerings. If the tears were a sign, it came with consequences. Not everyone in town saw them as comfort. A small but vocal group, people who had been hurt by religion, who had seen churches get rich on sorrow, said the tears were a trick played by someone seeking to manipulate the town. They asked for tests and for cameras and for plastic tubs to collect samples. The debate split neighbors the way cold winds split the river ice. Requests came to the mayor for official testing, and the mayor, who had kept his composure through most things, agreed. Experts were called in. A chemist from the state university took a sample, wearing gloves like someone handling a relic. He tested it in a lab, and the report came back unhelpful, consistent with pure water. It read, no minerals, no airborne contaminants, nothing that explained why only this particular place should weep and why the water had felt warm to those who tasted it. The scientist offered a polite shrug. There are things science can't yet measure, he said in his report, a line that read like a surrender or like humility depending on who read it. That simple sentence, there are things science can't yet measure, ran like a current through the town. Some took it as a final validation, others as a provocation. And while the town argued, larger forces turned their heads. A TV crew from a regional station set up lights and cables and treated the church like a set. Politicians visited for the cameras, speaking about community values and about respecting history. A religious group from a big city camped out for a week, singing songs and filling their own warrens with the heavy breath of praise. They camped near the church, and every morning the churchyard filled with their folding chairs and bright jackets. For some in Willow Creek it felt like relief, for others it felt like invasion. Through all of this pulse and counterpulse, Walter held to a quiet center. He spoke less now and listened more, like a man who had finally taken up a long-postponed duty. People came with scarves and sandwiches and folded stories, and he listened and prayed. He did not ask for witnesses, he did not ask for reward, he merely sat and held the rosary. Once, a teenage boy who had been among the group that desecrated the statue months before walked to Walter and dropped to his knees. He cried for a long while without speaking and then offered Walter a small apology that was more about being sorry for himself than for what he had done. Walter folded the boy's head between his scarred hands and whispered a Hail Mary so soft it was more a breath than a prayer. Tension swelled the night. A storm rolled in from the west, the sky turned low and black, and the wind arrived carrying something like the sense of a decision. People gathered inside the church, neighbors, skeptics, the curious, the devoted. They sat shoulder to shoulder, a town crammed into a small nave, the heat of bodies making the cold less sharp. Walter sat just behind the front pew, his thin jacket pulled close, hands closed around the familiar rosary. As the storm hit, thunder clapped like a gavel and the windows shook. Rain lashed the stained glass with fists of cold water. Then, in the center of that beating sound, something else occurred. The lights flickered and blew out one by one. In the dark, with only the candles to guide them, a voice, soft, measured, and unmistakably human, spoke from the statue's direction. Come, it said, not loud but clear to those with ears to hear. Everyone froze. Fathers put hands over children. The priest crossed himself to the extent that his fingers hurt. A man in the third pew whispered that he could smell roses with each word that came. Walter rose slowly, like a man rising to a farewell. He walked forward without hesitation, the congregation parting like water to make room for a thing that had taken them all without permission. When Walter reached the base of the statue, he set his rosary on the stone ledge. He looked back at the crowd with eyes that were both weary and bright, and he spoke 4 words, forgive them all. Then something even the hardened watchers in the church did not expect. Walter stepped up onto the pedestal and lifted his hand toward the statue as if to touch it. The moment his fingers brushed the cool marble, a gust of wind rushed through the church with the hollow voice of a distant ocean, and the candles guttered as if breath had been taken from them. People clutched one another, a child started to wail, the priest cried out the name of Jesus. When the lights returned a few seconds later, Walter was gone. Not missing, not slumped on the floor, but gone as if the air itself had swallowed him. All that remained where he had stood was a small, neat circle of melted wax and a single, heavy rosary lying across Mary's stone hand, beads glinting like a tiny river. The congregation screamed and spilled into the rain, pushing past one another into the churchyard, where the storm was already washing the tracks of their feet. They searched the town for hours, down the tracks, behind the diner, under bridges, at the river's edge. A pair of footprints led from the pedestal across the churchyard, wet and well-formed, and then stopped at the gate as if someone had stepped into the air. The prince did not continue into the street. A neighbor who had watched from his porch swore he saw a light like a lantern rising from the church and moving eastward, but when he called to the mayor could not find such a thing, and told the man to go inside and sleep. By dawn the town was crammed with whispers and wet shoes. Someone took the rosary from Mary's hand and wrapped it in a cloth so it wouldn't be stolen. Someone else found Clara's Bible, open and face down, its thin pages fanned with a pressed flower that had not been there before. The reporter's camera flashed like a nervous insect. Dr. Sims took his notes with a hand that trembled despite himself. No one could explain where Walter had gone, and the answer had the shape of a question everyone was afraid to ask. Had Walter been taken up, as saints sometimes are in the old stories, or had he simply walked away to die in some cold field alone? The town split along that question like a cracked log. Some wanted to say it was a miracle and claimed their hearts lightened with the claim, others wanted proof, and the lack of it made them furious. In the weeks that followed, the town held vigil. They kept the rosary on the statue, polished and protected. They sang into the night, half in hope and half in desperation, because singing is a small thing that lets people pretend they have some agency in an event too big to fit inside their lives. Walter's jacket remained behind the tracks for a while, folded over a milk crate as if he might return to find it where he left it. The jacket was eventually taken to the church, washed, and hung on a peg near the sacristy. No one dared to put it on. They treated it like a relic, small and sacred and trembling with unanswered questions. The story of the town spread beyond Willow Creek and into nightstands and breakfast bars across the region. People argued about faith, others argued about fraud, and somewhere between the fight and the prayer, the town of Willow Creek held its breath, knowing in some quiet place that the answer, whatever it was, had not yet finished speaking. That night, as snow began again to hush the town, someone walking by the churchyard thought they saw a figure in blue at the top of the hill, looking down as quietly as a lighthouse. They blinked, and the figure was gone. The town kept the story, they kept the rosary, and they kept the question, wrapped tight as a wound. The question was simple but terrible: where had Walter gone, and who, if anyone, would tell them the truth? They kept the rosary in the church, wrapped in a clean handkerchief and placed on the altar where sunlight struck it in the morning like a small, stubborn promise. People came in waves now, pilgrims who drove through the night and families from neighboring towns who wanted to see with their own eyes what the papers had called the Willow Creek events. Some walked in silence, others wept, and a few, no more than 3 but enough to matter, sat in the back and watched for signs of fraud. The town had become a magnet, and the magnet picked up not only the faithful but the wounded, the curious, and the hungry for a story. After Walter's disappearance, life in Willow Creek split into a careful sort of fever. Neighborhoods hummed with whispered theories. Some said Walter had been taken to heaven that night, called like the saints of old. Others believed he had slipped away in his confusion and found a quiet place to die. There were people who claimed that he had been taken bodily, lifted, drawn, carried, by the Virgin herself. Those people lifted their hands and told the story with a kind of holy certainty that made other people's teeth ache. In the weeks that followed, the town tried to settle into a new rhythm, but the rhythm kept changing like a piece of music whose time signature kept shifting. The reporters left and came back. A doctor from the state brought equipment to test the statue waters again. The mayor tried to regulate the flow of cars and set times for pilgrims to come so the town's main road wouldn't choke. The priest read the news with a heavy heart and washed the church floor more than usual, as if cleaning might thin the tension. Not only visitors arrived, secrets came, too. A stack of old letters surfaced in the county office, the kind of brittle paper that remembers names. They were addressed to Walter Jameson, written in a young man's lanky script, letters from men he had served with, signed Eddie and Tommy, and other names he'd held in his memory. People gathered at Clara's kitchen table to read them aloud. Her hands trembled as she traced Eddie's looping letters, and when she came to the line that said, "Hold my Place, she wept so hard the room shrank around her. Walter's wartime memory had always been a kind of litany for the town, a string of boys he had loved and lost, but the letters pulled a new strand free, evidence that Walter had, for a time, been someone who loved fiercely and kept his promises. Those letters made his disappearance feel less like a spectacular miracle and more like the continuation of a life that had always been a litany of promises kept to the dead. If the town sought proof, it also sought witnesses. People began to take turns keeping vigil at the church. They took camp chairs and thermoses of coffee and sat through nights that smelled of rain and old leaves. They shared stories of their own, of sudden comfort, of a mother who said a pain in her side eased after she touched the melted wax on the altar, of a boy's fear that lifted after a night of praying. The ledger swelled. People wrote and taped their names to its pages and left fingerprints in the margins like a map of the town's need. Not everyone's story was of comfort. A man named Luke, once a strong-handed foreman at the mill and now unemployed, grew more bitter as the town's attention grew. He had been hurt by the hand of religion before. His own sister had died at a church-run home with explanations that didn't satisfy him, when the statue wept, when radios played old hymns on their own and candles burned on cold nights. Luke kept his head down and went to his own bottle. He said the town was being conned, that people were turning their sorrow into spectacle and giving their grief away in exchange for something the town could not pay. Then, one night in March, when the wind carried the smell of thawing earth and the town felt the fragile hope of spring, somebody did something irredeemable. They struck the statue with a blunt object, not once but several times. Mary's marble face, once softly carved and compassionate, bore new marks, chips and a long hairline crack that splintered from her temple down like a map of pain. Whoever had done it had worked carefully, stealthily, and with malice. The town woke to the sound of the crowd that gathers when a bloodless crime has been found. A child at the bus stop saw the damage first and ran, cheeks flushed with panic, and before noon the police tape looped like a thin, ugly ribbon around the churchyard. People's reactions revealed them. Clara sat on the rectory steps and wept in silence. The mayor's calm face crumpled when he saw the statue. The priest said mass with hands that shook. A strand of the town's faith unspooled in a single, sharp hour. Some of the faithful cried out for vengeance, others prayed for forgiveness, and both groups looked at each other as if one of them might be right. When the police investigated, they found prints, but the prints led nowhere definite. They found fragments of a glove and a cigarette butt and a smear of what looked like oil. The security footage from a neighboring convenience store showed a figure in a dark coat moving like a shadow across the empty lot. The face was obscured. Whoever destroyed Mary's calm face had done her violence carefully, like someone who hates the idea of mercy. You could see the wound on the statue from Main Street. It felt like a personal affront, not only to the faithful but to anyone who had watched the town change under the touch of what might have been a miracle. The mayor urged calm and asked for donations to restore the statue. The priest begged for patience, but within the angry and the afraid a quieter terror grew. If the physical symbol could be broken, could the promise it represented be broken, too? That night the town split harder than it had before. People who had once sat together in pews found themselves at different tables in the diner, avoiding each other's eyes. Someone graffitied a slogan on the mailroom wall, "Stop the worship of idols," and someone else left a bouquet of candles and a note that said, "Love first, answers later." The dispute was not only spiritual but human. Who had the right to grieve? Who had the right to interpret a miracle? Who could decide whether suffering was sacred or profane? As this communal unease simmered, small miracles, quiet, private ones, continued, and that puzzled people. A boy who had been born deaf for several months woke one morning hearing a mourning dove sing outside his window. A woman who had said she could not forgive her brother found herself forgiving him in a hospital parking lot with no explanation. The pattern was maddening. Public violence and private solace arrived hand in hand, like thieves and healers dancing in the same hall. Walter remained absent. His jacket hung in the sacristy like a relic. His shoes were placed neatly beneath a pew and polished by an old woman who came every afternoon to pray. Some who had loved him clung to the idea that he had been taken to a place beyond pain. Others feared the worst, that he had wandered off to die somewhere alone and that his disappearance had been sanctified afterward by hungry people who needed a miracle to make sense of their sorrow. And then the letters opened another door. A document surfaced in a county archive. Walter Jameson had once been court-martialed, records said. Though the papers were smudged and incomplete, the mention of a court-martial sent a sharp ripple through the town. People who had once seen Walter only as an old man with a rosary began to murmur questions about his past, about things that had been left unspoken for decades. The county historian, an amiable man who loved old facts like children love toys, pieced together what he could: an incident in which men under Walter's command had been lost during a confused mission, an accusation of negligence that had been buried and then publicly forgiven long ago, Suddenly the town's narrative grew complicated. If Walter had been a flawed man, if he had made mistakes that had cost lives, what did that mean about the miraculous visitation? Could mercy be offered to someone who had hurt others? The question pressed like a thumb in the town's conscience. Some said, ardently, yes, the Virgin visits the broken, the guilty, the ashamed. Others said it was nonsense, miracles feed the reputations of flawed men to make sinners comfortable. At the center of this tumult, Clara did a thing that startled everyone. She went to the county records office and brought back an envelope marked with the military stamp and the faint scent of old tobacco. Inside was a folded photograph that featured a young Walter and a young Eddie, their arms slung over one another's shoulders, smiles like a promise that should have lasted. On the back, in a boy's handwriting, someone had written, "To my brother in arms, till the end." Clara held the photograph up and said, simply, "We don't get to choose who needs saving." The finding softened something in the town, at least on one hot afternoon when the sun turned the snow to mud and the people felt the tug of spring. The mayor, finally, called for a town meeting. It was packed, people leaned on the walls and drifted in like tide lines. He wanted to set rules about visitors, to help anyone who was hurting find care, to protect the church from further violence. Father O'Connell said a prayer that the town might remember humanity before it remembered headlines. Clara read Eddie's letter aloud, and the room listened, the way a crowd listens to the sound of rain after a drought. It was after that meeting that the stranger arrived. He walked into town with a slow, deliberate pace, not like the tourists who arrived in packs but like a man who had carried something heavy for a long time and was finally coming to set it down. He introduced himself as Henry Mallory, Eddie's son, he said, who had traveled from a city 2 states away when he heard about the miracle in Willow Creek. He carried a small cardboard box in his hands, and his voice broke when he said his father's name. "He was my granddad," Henry told the crowd in the diner later, "and I never knew him. People say he died in '44, but I have a note from him that says he left something for someone named Walter." He opened the box and inside were mementos, a pocket Bible, a rusted dog tag, a folded map with a corner burned. There was also a letter, hands shaking, written by Eddie to Walter. In it Eddie had promised to look out for Walter's place in the world. Some trove of loyalty between men at war. Henry's presence did something unexpected. It made the story not only about miracles but about human memory, how people carry each other across time. He said he had come because he wanted to know what had become of a man who had been his grandfather's friend. He wanted to see the place where his grandfather's name lived. He wanted to hear the story straight. Walter did not return, but Henry's simple, human need, no cameras, no headlines, just a grandson's longing, cut through the public fervor like a sharp knife. People surrounded Henry with their own stories, of loss, of a father's promises, of the way grief hollows you and then offers a shape. They touched the items he carried with reverence. A woman who had been at the War Office in her youth said she had an old map that matched the burn mark on Eddie's folded map, and that sometimes letters are the only way to cross a generation. Spring gathered itself around Willow Creek in a way that felt almost daring. The river swelled with thaw, and the smell of wet earth made people less careful with their tongues. There were moments when the town felt like a living thing pulling itself together. Children laughing in the schoolyard, a man who had been sober for weeks showing off his first clean bill of health to a friend, Clara sitting with Henry and telling him about the boy in the photograph. For a week, at least, the town remembered tenderness. Then, on a rain-slick afternoon when the clouds hung low and the school buses left their hiss on the road, the statue vanished. Not stolen in the night with loud trucks and ropes, but quietly, as if the earth had decided it was time. 1 minute the pedestal stood with the empty space where Mary had been, the next, there was only an indentation as if a stone had been pulled clean from a mold. Witnesses said they saw nothing suspicious, no ropes, no trucks. The police were baffled. The mayor insisted there had been no permit for removal. People whispered of another kind of theft, the theft of the sacred, that no courthouse could remedy. The absence was worse than the damage had been. A broken face could be repaired. A removed statue suggested a decision had been made somewhere beyond their control. For some it was a sign that the town had finally lost its center. For others, it was proof that Mary had gone where she was needed elsewhere. The town responded in 2 ways. Some staked a vigil on the empty pedestal and left flowers and notes. Others organized a search for the statue, calling salvage companies and religious art dealers, hoping the stone had been taken for sale or to be displayed elsewhere. The search turned up nothing. At night, the village held its breath. The air smelled of damp wood and old prayers. People gathered on the square and sang hymns softly, hands clasped so tightly palms turned white. They lit candles and left them in a circle around the hollow where Mary had stood. The candlelight registered on camera as a thin, pulsing aureole, a photo that would later be passed around online and read by readers who would argue about its meaning. And then, just as suddenly as she had disappeared, the statue returned. Nobody saw who put her back. One morning the pedestal bore the statue again, whole and unblemished, as if the vandal strikes and the theft and the mouth of the world had been undone in the night. The town blinked awake to the sight of Mary's face, uncracked, serene. Those who had kept the vigil told a story of a figure in a blue shawl who moved in the dark and set the statue down with hands that trembled but were sure. The figure vanished toward the hills and was gone. No one could say whether it had been a person or something else. The restoration calmed some fears and inflamed others. People who had wanted proof of human agency in the theft now saw what they had hoped for, a return that felt like mercy. Others wondered if the statue's return would be the end of the matter, or if it would be the beginning of something heavier. The town, with its neighbors and its strangers, gathered again at the church. They brought flowers and left them in bundles. They left notes, prayers, and an abundance of questions. In the middle of that gathering, a small boy named Joshua tugged at Henry's sleeve and pointed. Henry followed his finger to the statue's feet and found, tucked in the stone's base, a single, folded scrap of paper. On it were 2 words, written in a hand that was no secretary's neatness but the nervous script of someone who had been touched: "Forgive yourself." That scrap of paper would become a kind of gospel in Willow Creek. It was passed from hand to hand, read aloud at the diner and at the library, and pinned to the ledger. It seemed to land in the secret places people had worried about, places where guilt sat like a stone. For some, it was an instruction; for others, it was a dare. And then, after the sermon and the hymns and the leaving of flowers, Henry walked away toward the tracks with the small box of his grandfather's things. He looked back once at the statue, at the crowd, at the town that had become both shrine and witness. He put his hand to his mouth and whispered something like a blessing. He did not see the light that came like a slow breath across the fields, not until he had nearly reached the railway. When he turned, he found a man standing by the broken crates near the railway, a man who looked like the photo Walter had kept under his jacket, bent, weathered, hands that trembled but were steady. Walter, not a ghost and not a saint, but a man who had walked back into the town like someone coming home after a long absence. He was thinner than the photograph suggested, and his eyes held a sort of quiet that made Henry's breath catch. Before anyone else could see, before the crowd realized it, Walter walked forward and put one hand on Henry's shoulder and the other on the rosary that still hung from his neck. He said, in a voice that was a whisper and a roar at once, "Tell Eddie I kept my promise." People came running then, the priest, the mayor, Clara, the children with shouting joy. Walter did not speak long. He sat on the crate and told fragments, of a place he had walked where the war was like a film that rewound and then stopped, of a woman in blue who smelled like roses and said, "It's not too late." Of air that felt like forgiveness, of things he'd been carrying for 70 years that at last he laid down. He said he had been not taken but carried, for a while between one life and another, and that when he was put back, it was with a mission, to help the town learn to carry one another. His return did not erase the ledger entries, the letters, the court-martial papers that revealed a painful truth about his past. What it did was teach the town a harder lesson, that miracles do not smooth history, they remap it. People cheered, people cried, and some sat with crossed arms and hardened faces, uncertain what to feel when a man's name and a town's history were tangled like fishing line. Walter stayed for a week. He sat at the diner and told small soldier stories, the quiet ones that didn't involve glory but involved friendship. He went to the cemetery and knelt by graves of men he had loved. He walked to the rectory to sleep under a clean blanket, though he sometimes chose the tracks because he liked the smell of the rails and the way the wind moved the grass. He received visits from the young and the old. Children asked for his stories, and he told them about a man named Eddie who had once given him a caramel candy and a place to sleep. He taught the children how to whistle like soldiers and how to fold a letter so it kept secrets safe. People in Willow Creek began to change in small ways that piled up like the steady accumulation of small stones, an earnestness at the counter, a letter written after years of silence, a promise kept. The vandalism remained a wound, but the wound had closed enough for new skin to form. Some nights the town gathered by the church and sang, not for the cameras but because singing felt like an honest thing to do when you were afraid. And in the final quiet morning before Walter left again, this time not to vanish without trace but to step into the long sleep of an old man finally free, he walked to the little patch of rail where he had slept and called the names of his lost men one by one like a rosary beads list. The sky that morning was mercifully clear, and the sun warmed his face. He held Eddie's photograph in Henry's hand, and he looked up at the place where the Virgin statue watched over them all. He smiled a tired smile and said, "I am going now, I am ready." The last thing he did was not dramatic. He did not perform miracles or preach sermons. He simply stood, steadied by his cane, and said, "Remember to take care of one another," and folded his hands like a man who had been given an answer and wanted only to pass it on. He died 2 days later in his sleep at the rectory, his mouth shaped in the prayer he had said in foxholes and in lonely nights. The town buried him with honors for a soldier and a rosary over his folded hands. The funeral was full, more than the church could easily hold. People who had argued and doubted stood side by side. The mayor spoke of community, the priest spoke of grace, and Henry read the letter Eddie had written, ending with the line, "Hold my place." The children scattered rose petals by the gravesite, and the sun shone like a benediction, soft and wide. Willow Creek carried on with its smallness and its grief. The statue remained on its pedestal, watched and guarded and loved. People still came from out of town, and they found not spectacle but a town that had been left a little wiser, a little more tender. They found a rosary still on the altar and a ledger with pages full of fingerprints and prayers, and somewhere in the rectory was Walter's jacket folded neatly on a chair, a small relic of a man who had been both flawed and chosen. Years later, on the anniversary of the first snow when the bell had chimed and warned them to care for the light, the town gathered not to ask for miracles but to give thanks. They lit candles and left notes. A child touched the base of the statue and felt warmth, and no one was surprised. In the library, young Henry, older now, with children of his own, opened the photograph of Eddie and Walter and read the old letter aloud. Clara's hands had gone thin with time, but she sat in the front pew and smiled. At the edge of town, the railway hummed like a waking thing, and on certain nights people swore they smelled roses on the air though no one could say why. In small moments, when the river ran steady, when a child laughed without care, when a neighbor brought soup to another, the town remembered the scrap of paper that had been left at the statue's feet. Forgive yourself. The story of what happened to Walter and to Willow Creek spread like the stories of other small towns, stitched into the fabric of people's lives by those who needed them. Some told it as proof of miracles, others told it as a folk tale about a town that had learned to look after its own. Both versions felt true in different ways. Some nights, when the wind carried the memory of that first snow, the people of Willow Creek would stand by the church and recount small things, a rooster that crowed at midnight, a child's sudden recovery, a storm that stopped at the town line. And always, somewhere inside the telling, was the same quiet instruction, a line that had been written on a scrap of paper and left at the feet of a statue. Forgive yourself. It was a line the town tried to live by, even when it proved the hardest thing. They fed it to each other in small doses. A phone call to someone who had been estranged, a neighbor who did not ask for repayment, a priest who listened without sermon. It made them softer. It made them less certain. It made them safer. In the end, Willow Creek kept both its wounds and its peace. The Virgin statue looked down with a grace that seemed patient and relentless at once. The ledger grew dusty and thicker each year. People who visited came away saying the same thing. There is a place where the ordinary and the miraculous cozy up together and make a life that is messy and holy. If you ever find yourself passing through a town like Willow Creek, stop for a while, put your hand on a stone, listen to the wind, and be ready to be surprised. The world has a way of opening where you least expect it, and sometimes the saving comes not in thunder but in the quiet insistence of one old man's promise kept. Thank you for listening to this story. If it moved you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell so you won't miss the next tale. Your support keeps these stories alive, stories of faith, of loss, and of small mercies that change everything.